Hello, my name's Rob Durham,
And I'm John Chappell.
and you're listening to another episode of the Gyrolab Spin.
So today's podcast, we're going to deal with some advanced troubleshooting. So we're going to give specific examples and solutions for those specific examples. So I think it's some really useful information here. So hopefully this will be useful to you.
Yeah, and I think one thing to keep in mind for those who have been using a plate-based system for years and are transitioning to the gyro system, there are some additional considerations, and we'll talk a bit about those and some ways of thinking about troubleshooting that might be slightly different than what you've been used to.
So today's podcast, the material was actually prepared for one of our user meetings, Gyros user meetings, and I would like to give a special thank you to Eric, Linda, Nina and Anne who helped to put this material together.
Yep, so today's agenda then is we're going to talk a little bit about troubleshooting in general and then go over a few specific case studies so that we can help you to think about troubleshooting when you're seeing specific problems with your assays. So let's kick this off and we'll talk about troubleshooting in detail. And so I'll give you a matrix to think about what you see with the results and then possible solutions so that you have a starting point for how you can approach troubleshooting on the Gyrolab. So here I won't go over these in individual examples in detail, but you can see here on the left in this table the types of issues that you see. And one of the things I always want to do is to differentiate when I'm seeing a high CV issue. If I can ascertain whether the high value is over recovery, higher than I expect, or whether I'm seeing a CV issue because it's low a value is low or under recovering relative to what I expect. And so you'll see this in your standard curves and your QCs, where the low one just doesn't sit on the curve, or the high one may be much higher than the curve, and then looking at the viewer profiles will then help you to determine that. Again, and then some other things that you want to be cognizant of is what's going on in the background. Assay drift, may be an issue, and there you may want to do a test where you'd run the same concentration across a whole curve. Or if you see just dropouts, that could be an indication that maybe there's some problem with the liquid handler or your instrument's not performing correctly. And the last sort of category that that's more commonly seen is a negative response values. Occasionally you'll get some kind of contamination, and because of the way the system does a background subtraction, if there's some non-specific fluorescent signal on the column, that gets subtracted away, and then when you rinse that off and you see the background subtracted value, you'll end up with a negative value, and so that can be an indication there's some kind of contamination going on. But again, this is just an overview, John, and then some things for people to consider when they're starting to look at their assay problems.
I mean, troubleshooting is required for many immunoassays. So being a fully automated system, there some of the issues will be slightly different with a manual based assay. So it's important to understand the error and the potential cause. And I think also sometimes people are quick to blame the instrument sometimes when it ends up being reagent related. So there's a lot of considerations when troubleshooting, particularly for a fully automated assay.
And I would say in my time here, and John and I have been using the system for going on 20 years now, I would say that the majority of the time reagents are usually the root cause of a problem. If you have good reagents, you're going to make a beautiful assay. If you have poor reagents or poorly controlled reagents, you're going to have difficulty building a good assay on any platform.
No, exactly. So a rubbish assay on ELISA, it couldn't actually be rubbish on Gyros as well. So
I wish it would fix all of the bad assays out there, but it doesn't do that. So.
Yeah, but sometimes it can improve. It's a matrix effect, or and there is a lot of flexibility with the Gyrolab methods, so we can really help improve assays. So some of the common causes of poor assay performance really is a follow-on from the previous slide. So you can have low signal, loss of signal, so an increased background, so you can look at contamination of your exit buffers or other reagents, high CVs, how to confirm, sometimes a high CV, if there's a trend, a replicate higher or lower, there may be a trend in the replicate, so that can tell you something. Precision issues can be to do with the detect reagents, you know, so you have to spin the detect reagent. You can also look at high CVDs over recovery, you know, and the duplicate can tell you something.
Yeah, and I think one of the real keys here is that looking at those two viewer profiles from the two replicate can tell you a tremendous amount about
Exactly.
what's going on.
Exactly.
If you're seeing the same exact signal, because the viewer often auto scales things, so you might see a peak that looks exactly the same. That would indicate that you're seeing specific signal, but that one is higher than the other. Then that gives you a clue about where is that signal coming from.
Yeah. I mean, the Gyrolab is an automated system, so carryover can happen. So you need to know how to confirm it and how to solve it, because 99% of the time you can solve carryover issues, but you need to recognize that is an issue. And I'm a big believer that carryover is better solved by buffer solutions rather than necessarily over cleaning the instrument.
Yeah, I think often I'll talk about a two-step process for dealing with carryover. One is to use the right diluent, and then make sure you're using a stringent wash solution to clean the needles. It's a two-step, you know,
exactly.
And some people will do one step cleaning the needles, but yet, you know, they let the needles get really dirty because they haven't optimized what they're diluting their samples with. So here you can see we have an assay where we have the biotinylated antigen, and we're looking at a titer assay where we're measuring a monoclonal antibody, one would presume.
So it's an antibody detection assay against the antigen.
Yep. And what we're looking at here is our positive control in green. And then we have a high titer sample that we would expect to be at least parallel to the positive control, or similar to the positive control. What you see is much lower than expected signals. So we've got to diagnose what's happening here. So the first step would then be to take a look at the table and see if we can see any patterns of needle usage or patterns on the CD that are suspicious.
And the good thing is that the software can be used to see this information. So this is important for the diagnosis of issues.
So here, if you take a look at the table, then you can look at the high titer sample, and what you notice is we're having a much lower than expected response in certain segments of the CD. So if you look at the A or the B segments, you see there all the values are much lower than they would be expected.
Yeah, and then you can see in the C, you can see that the replicates are what you'd expect and more towards the standard curve.
Yeah, and the nice thing about the software is it allows you to exclude those values without really deleting anything. Once you've excluded them, it will recalculate, redraw the curve, and now with all of those low values excluded, you can see that you get a curve that's closer to what you would expect. Now you're going to have to rerun this, but you know, the idea is if it's a segment related thing, then it's probably something related to one of the common reagents, either the capture or the detect was not added in an appropriate volume to make the assay perform as expected.
So the explanation for this is the values are expected in segment C, and the responses you can be seen in segments A and B. So the probable cause for this is the too little volume of the capture added to the plate, or maybe there's an air bubble in the capture reagent.
That's correct, and so certainly the first thing you'd want to do is go ahead and rerun this assay, making sure that there were no bubbles in the plate. Now, I've had customers that like to spin the plate to reduce the chance that there's a little air bubble at the very bottom of that microtiter plate well. Now that can have some negative consequences though. So if you have samples that could potentially be pelleted, then you're going to create a little pellet at the bottom of the well. So spinning isn't always the right answer, especially with plasma or serum samples.
Yeah. No, we've had a great example when somebody was doing with 100% matrix and overspinning the plate, and then that actually made things worse because it, as you say, pelleted everything into the bottom of the well, and then the instrument goes to the bottom of the well to suck up the samples. So that's the important part.
Yeah. So again, one of the ways to get rid of those air bubbles is to use the little thumbnail flick of the of the bottom of the PCR plate to sort of release that bubble. If it was particularly onerous, you could use a pipette tip to drop down there. A clean pipette tip might release the bubble as well.
And yeah, when you're diagnosing this sort of issue, you can always go back to the plate and see if there's any dead volume remaining.
Yeah.
So that will indicate if it's completely dry, then you probably hadn't had enough sample.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had an example where somebody has added exactly the volume stated on the work list, and obviously their pipette is under pipetting.
It might be, so typically you're not relying on the pipette to give you accurate pipetting as long as you've created your dilution series accurately. And but when it asks for 20 microliters, you need 20 microliters in there. If you put anything less than that in there, you might see that you've not added enough.
I like to add more.
Yeah.
If it says 7 microliters, I like to do at least 10. If it says 20, I like at least 25.
And certainly that's useful if you have that extra volume. But I will say that having worked in mouse CSF in the past, I didn't always have extra volume. And I know that what the system asks for in terms of total volume for the samples perspective is enough, including the dead volume, to do all the replicates that you want. So you don't have to really add more, especially if samples become precious. But do make sure that your pipettes are calibrated so that you're adding an accurate volume. Never lie to the instrument. That's my rule.
Yeah, very true.
So here's another example where you had unexpected dropouts. We're looking at a standard 7-point curve. And we had different concentrations of detection reagent were being tested. So this is a detect titration. And looking at one example of the curve here, you see that standard 6 and standard 2 were totally dropped out. No signal in either one of them. And so the hypothesis would be that maybe something happened to the transfer of those samples.
So then you can actually look at the needle transfer and see if there's any reason why these two results are related to each other, and you can use the extended view in the evaluator software to do that. So then by looking at the needle ID, you can see that the two low standard response values are controlled by needle 5 and 6. And we do know that both these needles are controlled by syringe pump 3. So this gives you a potential reason for the issue.
Yeah, when you can reason through, again, this is a part of what's different about the gyro system, and working with automation, you have to know kind of how the system is controlled, how things are pipetted, which needles handle which samples, and this table can give you that information that helps you with your detective work. So here you can see, one of the things you want to be cognizant of is the proper handling of the pump liquid. So here in the first example on the left, you can see that things are potentially kinked. If you push those filter frits all the way to the bottom, you can potentially kink that peak tubing, and that may be the source of a problem here. If, say, the pump 3 peak tube from the hydraulic line was kinked or broken, then that could explain why there wasn't any transfer happening. The other situation on the right is you can see that all the filters are pulled up high in the liquid, and so you want to keep those down in the liquid to be sure that throughout the whole assay that those who are in the liquid and not sucking up air and creating air in the system, which would create error in the system as well. And so on the far example to the right with the green check, you can see that's where everything, the lines are nice and straight. There's nothing that's kinked, and the filters are fully submerged within the liquid, so we don't have an issue. There again, I always check when we starting a run to make sure that there's no air bubbles visible in the syringe pumps. We know that that's going to create some error in the liquid transfer. So if you see that air in the syringe pumps, then you're going to need to prime those several times until you see that go away, or you might have to manually reprime the syringe, which can be done with the assistance of your field application scientist as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's important that you look at the fluidics and the maintenance of the fluidics, because if you look after the system, it will look after you, and
Absolutely.
It will work well.
Yeah. So turning back to our example again, you can see that, you know, one of the steps you might do is to run a functionality check to be sure that you're getting proper liquid transfer. And if something were amiss with your pump and it's failing the Gyrolab functionality check, one option that you have is to sort of disable pump 3. And then as long as you have at least 3 pumps left, you'll be able to continue with your sample analysis. It will adjust, and it can use 3 pumps to do the sample transfer, and the 4th pump would then be used to make sure it's doing the reagents.
I mean, does this have any impact on the runtime?
Yeah, it's going to increase the runtime slightly because it's not quite as efficient in doing the transfers. The transfers are going to take just a little bit longer. One of the other sort of details here that you'd want to be aware of is, let's say pump 5 were the one that we're failing. That's the one that typically does the reagents, and you can see the check mark there for reagents. If you had to disable that one, you would then, of course, select another pump to do the reagents and then deselect that one for samples. So you'd still be running with 4 pumps.
One common question we get from customer is, what are normal response levels? And this is quite important actually, particularly if you're running say an ELISA assay or an MSD assay. You're used to a certain level like OD or ECL units. So, and actually, when it comes to Gyrolab, it actually does depend on the assay. So this is really kind of some guides. So if you run in kind of a PMT setting around 1%, you know, you would expect your blanks between 0.01 and 0.1.
Mm-hmm.
But saying that blanks above 0.1 can be okay.
Yeah.
And blanks above 1%, you know, above 1 at 1% is high, but it still could be okay. It really depends on your signal to noise and your assay range.
Yeah.
So there's no necessary rule of thumb, and it does depend on assay performance.
Yeah, and it's certainly, you know, whether you saw a curve like the blank response on the left with the response of 0.01 or on the right with a 0.07, those look like normal blanks. Of course, if you saw a response of 4.3, you'd say that's pretty high.
Yeah.
And you're seeing what looks like specific cross-reactivity in that column. That doesn't mean you couldn't run with that assay, but again, it's really going to limit your sensitivity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I still work on sensitivity being at least double the blank.
Yeah.
So you know, that means that in that case you'd need, you know, your lowest, you know, standard or lowest point on your curve would probably be at least 8.
Yeah.
So obviously that's really going to desensitize the assay.
So we've dealt with ones where we saw dropouts or lower than expected signal. Here's an example where we saw an unexpected increase in signal in the background. So this is a validated preclinical PK assay where they suddenly saw an increase in the background. It's a generic PK assay where they have a capture as an anti-human monkey absorbed. It's a therapeutic monoclonal antibody, I would assume a human, and they're diluting it in Rexif-H. The detection is an anti-human IgG, and the matrix is cyno serum. So what could have caused the unexpected high signal? What would you do to find out?
Maybe we should ask the audience, give them a few minutes to think.
Yeah.
And see if they can come up with a solution or what they think the issue is. So maybe we'll put a pause in for the thought process.
Yeah.
Or you can pause it.
Yeah. Well, there we've paused to give you a little bit of time to consider the answer, but here you can see one of the options that we want to consider is repetition of run with fresh buffers and reagents gave us a normal background, and then high response values were correlated with a specific bottle of Rexip H. So it's possible that that your Rexip buffer was contaminated in some way. The other point here is that the human samples were handled in the same lab, so you might be a situation where you've contaminated something in either the buffers or the pipettes that you're using to prepare your samples.
When I have IT problems, the solution is always switch everything off and put it back on again.
Yeah.
When it comes to immunoassays, it's always run everything with fresh buffers and fresh reagents. So it's normally a way of doing the diagnosis. So this really highlights the potential for contamination, and we see this a lot. People reusing pipettes into Rexip bottles, not aliquoting the buffer, and particularly when they're running preclinical assays and also human assays, particularly when they're doing a generic method, there is a high ability to potentially contaminate the buffers. So here you can see the impact of adding small amount of serum into the Rexip H buffer, and you can see the dramatic increase in background, just a really tiny amounts of serum, because even a little bit of serum, say on the bottom of your pipette where you're using to actually pipette on a generic animal assay, will have a huge impact on the potential contamination.
Yeah, and so this really illustrates the same problem you'd have with some sort of a carryover. The more sensitive your assay is, the more opportunity there is to sort of create a carryover problem with just very minute amounts of sample getting somewhere where it shouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think very early in my career, we used to run a lot of radio immunoassays, and there was always a potential for contamination, particularly when people were preparing the test articles or the matrix. So it's always best to handle those things away from the area where you're doing your assay to prevent contamination.
And then aliquoting, is a standard good practice to make sure that you're not going to go back into the bottle with a contaminated tip.
No, exactly. So now we're going to discuss some precision issues with the custom HCP assay. So the assay background, the assay had previously worked well. The reagents were labeled in large quantities and then stored in the freezer, and they were frozen for at least 1.5 years. And the study samples were new, so they were from a new process. So when we were looking at the viewer profiles, we can see precision issues, sometimes in the blanks, and there's also sample with low response values, so not so often in spike samples.
Right. So again, this is where the use of the viewer system will allow us to really do a deep dive and troubleshoot the binding profiles.
I think that I love the viewer, as you know. I think it's such an advantage.
Absolutely. So here you take a look at a few of these viewer profiles that we were discussing, and what you notice is there's a lot of these sharp peaks that don't look like specific binding on the column. In the upper two, they're what I would lovingly term shrapnel on there, and then sort of a cliff in the lower right one. The only peak that gives you sort of a normal looking shape, there is some material in there that's non-specific, but you get the lower left, you're seeing a more normal peak. And so we can look at this and tag these. You can see fluorescent spikes indicating potential maybe detection aggregates, and then the irregular peak in the lower right might be their sample or detection aggregates. And as we said earlier, the lower left looks like a more normal peak.
Yeah, the viewer profile just can give you a lot of information,
Yeah.
particularly for troubleshooting
Yeah,
purposes.
if you're just looking at
Yeah.
an OD
Yeah.
on an assay plate, that you really can't get that information.
Yeah. So when you are seeing these sort of fluorescent spikes, the first thing to always look at is to actually spin the detection.
Yeah.
And this is, common good practice anyway. But another potential solution would be to actually look at spinning the samples as well. Again, I'm a big advocate for spinning samples. It's a microfluidic system, so to ensure there is no particulate matter or precipitation that potentially can impact the detection.
Yeah, and I think another clue for this particular assay, we didn't show data necessarily to illustrate this, but when you see those spikes in the blanks, that would indicate that it's really driven by some reagent problem. And so centrifugation of the detection reagent stock for at least 4 minutes at 12,000 times G, or longer, even up to 10 minutes sometimes to do that. The other piece that was clue in this one was this reagent had been stored for 1.5 years in the freezer.
Yeah.
It might be getting to the end of its viable shelf life, and if you're seeing that, additional labeling of fresh batch might be indicated. So in this case, once they did the spinning, there were no spikes or outliers in the blank or the lower standards anymore,
Yep.
and that really fixed the problem for them.
So you can see here that the samples without centrifugation, you're getting irregular peaks. When the samples are centrifuged, suddenly the peaks are more normal. So you can see that this was the solution. It was about spinning the samples.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the key to good assay performance is to actually handle the sample and reagents in the right way. Spinning the detection reagent is a commonly resolved issues, and that this is very important.
Yeah.
Also, centrifugation of samples, and we find this particularly when people are thawing samples from the freezer. The freeze-thaw process can cause precipitation of proteins, etc. So vortexing, mixing samples, and also centrifuging can really help when assaying. So some people don't like centrifuging samples, but it can be quite critical with this that kind of microfluidic flow through with the Gyros system.
Yeah, and that'll really improve the assay performance. And again, you would want to carefully transfer after you've done your centrifugation of samples to the alquats back to a new tube to run your assay.
I mean, very early in my career, I learned that for all immunoassays that if you don't mix and you don't centrifuge samples, the performance is not as good. So it's not just the Gyrolab results that are impacted.
Exactly, and then a couple other places where you can really improve the assay performance is around what are we using for our stock solutions. Those need to be filtered. We've run into issues that especially customers who use use the instrument in a very high throughput manner. If they're not careful about filtering their stock solutions, they can run into precipitate problems that will impair instrument performance, and then or if you're in a relatively low throughput lab where you're not using the buffers regularly, then you want to make sure you have fresh buffers if you're not using them up.
Yeah, that's important. If you look after your system, it will look after you.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good mantra to keep in mind.
So kind of a useful investigation sometimes, particularly when you're seeing CV issues, is to investigate that trend. So what you can do is add the same concentration to the whole CD. I mean, back in my ELISA days, we always used to do whole plate precision, and it can help when things are going on.
Yeah.
And in this case, actually, we found that there was an issue with the capture antibody. So the actual, when the reagent is dispensing, there was a trend caused, and actually changing the buffer from PBST to Rexip actually improves the precision. And we've seen this because a lot of people not necessarily using traditional like antibodies for capture. They're using like other proteins, antigens. Sometimes you need to factor in this, and you may need to add this in a different buffer. So we have recommended some people use their capture not just in Rexib-F, but in other Rexibs as well, rather than just in PBST.
Yeah, I think it can be really difficult to diagnose problems with the compatibility of your capture and your detect reagents in the various buffers. But I think, again, having a little bit of an understanding of the physical chemical properties of your reagents will help give you clues when you start to see variability. And this kind of a test where you run the same sample on the whole plate really can highlight when you're seeing those trends, as you see in the orange figure.
Yeah, and I say 95% of the time Rexib is not needed for the capture, but PBST will work. But if you are using an alternative to an antibody, it is worth considering an alternative buffer.
Absolutely.
So now we're going to give you a carryover example and kind of an investigation. So what we saw, the reproducibility issues in the same run, and carryover was expected due to bad precision in experiment 2. So the Gyros suggestion was to actually perform a proper carryover test.
Yeah. So let's take a closer look at how this carryover test data is analyzed. So in this example, we've done a blank before, and then a high calibrator with all 8 needles, and then a blank after using all 8 needles. And so you can see the needles listed across the x-axis in this chart, 1 through 8. And then those responses are 3 responses, so it was done in triplicate, so there are 3 different colors. The blue, orange, and gray are the 3 responses for before, and then the 3 responses after are represented by yellow, blue, and green.
Yeah.
And so in this case, you can see that for needle 3, 5, 7, 2, and 6, there was a clear high carryover, and so suggested that there's some carryover problems that are happening.
Yeah, and what Gyros suggested was to clean the wash station, use PBS tween for wash station 1 and wash pumps, control the consumption of the wash buffer PBS versus wash buffer pH 11, and prepare 12-point standard curves to run in triplicate to investigate.
Yeah. So here you can see that in this example where we've explored the potential solutions for carryover, that we can still see the carryover present. And how do we know that? So if you look at this 12-point standard curve, you can see that those bottom 3 points are floating off the curve, suggesting there's over recovery compared to what you would expect. And further, that if you know that the way the needles handle the 12-point standard curve, you'll know that the blank is handled by needle 1, and then 3, 5, 7 do the top 3 points on the curve, 2, 4, 6, 8 do the middle 4 points on the curve, and then the bottom 3 points on your curve again are 3, 5, and 7, and those float off the curve, and you can see that you're still having some carryover.
So follow-up from this, really, the Gyros suggestions were to sonicate the filters from wash station 1 and 2, and then prime with 200% with hot water with wash station 1 and 2. Rob, do you want to comment on the use of hot water for cleaning the system?
Yeah, I think one of the things that people have done in the past when they've seen carryovers to sort of reprime the wash station with wash solution. What we know is that the pH 11 can start to accumulate in the wash station, crystallize there, and that will create blockage in the flow of the wash station, which then really dramatically reduces the efficiency of the wash station flow. So one of the solutions that we've provided to customers who are experiencing this is to sort of do a hot water prime of the wash station and use water to spray down the wash station to really thoroughly clean all of the crystallized pH 11 off that, and then try again.
And then this is coming more and more of a regular maintenance, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. So for folks that are using pH 11 as a default solution, they'll want to do that regularly when they're as part of their wash station maintenance to sort of mitigate the potential for wash station clogging.
I know we had a whole discussion around this at the user meeting in Europe, and it seems now we're now recommending more and more customers do this hot water wash.
Yeah.
And I know from the US meeting last year, you also gave training also on the water wash.
Yeah, exactly.
So the wash station maintenance in this case actually showed an improvement in the assay, and now the two standard curves are showing good reproducibility in the same run. There's no evidence of any carryover, particularly at the low part of the curve. And also we now see equal consumption of wash buffer. So obviously the blockage in the wash station was effectively using less solution. And it's a way of diagnosing this type of issue. So one thing we will say, the takeaway message from this podcast is wash station cleaning is critical. If you keep looking after your wash station, I think it will go a long way. And we would recommend, if you're using pH 11 for every assay, and I know from my own experience, pH 11 became the standard, because not that it was needed for every assay, but when you're running lots of different methods, it's useful to have it there. So please keep an eye on the wash station, and then we would recommend you initiate a weekly hot water prime.
And then I do a daily inspection at least of the wash station too. I've even had some folks will do a little rinse at the end of the day, but again, no need to add a lot of extra work unless it's warranted. But I think that the point is if you're defaulting to pH 11 so that you don't have to optimize for a second wash to mitigate carryover, then taking care of the wash station is a real important part. And one other subtle thing that I think is important to pick up from this too is, it's not always apparent that the buffers are being used accordingly, right? So if you look at the liquid level in your wash station solutions and you see that you're not using 100 mils in a typical run or in a typical prime, then that suggests that you're getting some clogging in the wash station line somewhere. And that's a real good way to sort of test that. So I'll take a Sharpie and mark on the bottle and then see that, in my prime, when I'm setting up to do a run for the day, that it actually did consume 100 mils of the wash station solution in both solutions. And you can set that in the maintenance of the system. So it's a good way to sort of do a check on whether or not you've got a clean wash station.
Yeah, I think that's a really good suggestion.
So what I've said in words on the previous slide really is illustrated by this image here on the right. You can see that after a priming, the amount of liquid was equal when we started, but then when you look at the volume left after the wash one, which is typically your PBS, is lower. It's used the full 100 mils versus the wash two, which is used somewhat less than 100 mils. So that, again, that use, especially when you're using pH 11 with overnight runs, you tend to run the risk of clogging things more frequently than you do. So I would definitely, if you're doing overnight runs, to be doing a rinse wash station prime in the next day to really mitigate the chance that your wash station is getting clogged up. So here, when you transfer an assay to a larger volume CD because you're wanting to improve the sensitivity, one of the risks is that you're going to uncover some problems that you didn't see with the less sensitive assay. So again, no carryover was observed using the 1000 HC CD, but when they transferred that CHO HCP assay to the BioAffy 4000 HC for improved sensitivity, they noticed that there was a potential carryover. And you can see this in the blank high blank test below, where the blanks before and then the blanks after, you can see a significant increase in the amount of signal that was observed there. So now that's suggesting that we need to do something about the carryover problem in this particular run.
Yeah, I think this is one, you need to do an investigation, and you may need to change buffers or modify the method to resolve the issue. But so it's something we don't see that often when transferring between CDs, but obviously in this case, for this assay, it obviously caused a carryover issue. So the solution for this problem, as we said, when the assay was transferred to from the 1000 HC to the 4000 HC, this increased the carryover issue. But what we found really was that if you use fresh pH 11 buffer, then this resolves the carryover issue. And we found actually that fresh pH 11 can be very useful for some tricky analytes. Sticky molecules that, that pH 11, I mean, we recommend up to a week storage, but there is definitely a reduction in its effectiveness sometimes for some analytes. So again, 99% of the time it's fine to prepare weekly, but on the odd occasion it does warrant fresh preparation. So it's something to investigate when you set up an assay, whether pH 11 will actually improve things.
Yeah, typically the pH 11 is produced in about a 1 liter batch at a time. And if you're running a couple runs in a day, that would consume most of the pH 11. So daily prep isn't too onerous. But I think it's interesting. And so what I'll often tell folks is when we say a week's time, I would say that's a 5-day expiration period. We hypothesize that some of the cleaning efficacy comes from a chlorinated compounds in the pH 11, and those will off gas as they're exposed to air and light, just like your pool. If you had a swimming pool chemicals, you know that you have to add chlorine periodically to improve the bactericidal efficacy of the solution. So in this case, we think that may contribute to why pH 11 can go off rather quickly.
I mean, now if you look at the product information sheet for pH 11, it does indicate that sometimes a daily prep is required for some analytes. So it's not the majority, but a minority. Rob, I'll let you describe wash station maintenance, as it's your favorite area.
Yeah, exactly. My favorite area. I don't know if favorite is the right word, but it's been the bane of my existence at times. So again, wash station daily is good, a good check. It doesn't take but 5 minutes to rinse the wash station down with little water. And in doing that, you're looking to see if there's any evidence of crystallization around wash station 2, particularly because you're using that pH 11 buffer, which we know has propensity to clog things up. Weekly only if you're only using wash station 1. Again, when you're using just wash station 1, you want to be cognizant of the potential for carryover, and so take a look at that periodically as well. But for the wash station maintenance, it will back down the need to do that daily wash station maintenance.
Yeah, it is so critical. I mean, as looking at supporting many customers, the wash station maintenance is not looking after the wash station is a major reason why some customers have issues.
Yeah, and as John has often said, if you look after your Gyrolab and your Gyrolab wash station, it will look after you.
Yeah, that's how you live your life.
That's right. Well, John, that brings us to the end of another Gyrolab Spin podcast.
Again, it's been fun. Again, my favorite area is troubleshooting. So.
Yeah, exactly. And then, as always, please reach out to John or I. The emails are listed there at the bottom of the page. Give a subscribe to our YouTube page where these podcasts are stored so that you can be notified when new episodes drop.
Yeah, please give us any suggestions. Contact us using the email address. Send us any suggestions for future podcasts. Your help is very much appreciated.
Yeah. Well, John, I guess then for now it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Thanks. Until next time.